There's a specific kind of silence that settles over a suburban street right after the police lights stop flashing. It's this heavy, ringing sort of quiet that makes you realize just how loud the madness was only moments before, and standing there on my porch, watching the taillights of two squad cars fade in the night, I finally felt like I could breathe for the first time in 3 years. If you've ever lived in a neighborhood with a homeowners association, you know the type of person I'm talking about. The one who treats a slightly overgrown dandelion like a personal insult to their lineage. But in our little corner of Silver Oaks, we didn't in Oppos. T just have a neighbor. We had Beatrice. Now, Beatrice was in Oppos. T just a stickler for the rules. She was a woman who seemingly woke up every morning, checked her blood pressure, and then decided the only way to stabilize it was to make sure my mailbox was the exact federally mandated shade of, in quote, desert sand, in quote, or whatever nonsense was in the bylaws that week. I'm a pretty laid-back guy. I work with my hands, I fix things, and all I ever wanted after a long shift was to come home, crack a beer, and play fetch with my golden retriever, Boomer, without feeling like I was being watched through a pair of high-power binoculars from the house across the street. But Beatrice, she had this way of appearing out of thin air, like a glitch in the Matrix, just standing there on the sidewalk with a clipboard and that thin, pinched expression that suggested she just smelled something sour. It started small, a note tucked under my windshield wiper about my tires touching the grass by half an inch. Then it escalated to formal warnings about the, in quote, audible volume, in quote, of my lawnmower at 10 a.m. on a Saturday. But it wasn't into Oppos. Until the fence incident that things truly went off the rails. I'd spent 3 weekends building a privacy fence in the backyard. Nothing crazy, just a standard cedar slat setup, so Boomer could run around without Beatrice recording his bathroom breaks for her, in quote, incident logs, in quote, and I followed every permit to the letter, or so I thought. That evening, I was in the kitchen, still covered in a bit of sawdust, tightening a loose hinge on a cabinet door while the smell of my wife's garlic chicken filled the house. And for a second, everything felt perfect, the kind of domestic bliss you see in commercials. Then came the knock, and it wasn't Oppos, a friendly, in quote, hey neighbor, can I borrow some sugar, in quote, kind of knock. It was a rhythmic, aggressive pounding that vibrated through the floorboards, the kind of sound that tells you your piece is officially over. I opened the door, and there she was, Beatrice, dressed in a crisp navy blazer like she was heading to a corporate board meeting instead of standing on a dusty porch at 7 p.m. And before I could even say hello, she was already pointing a manicured finger toward my backyard. In quote, it's non-compliant, Arthur, in quote. She snapped, her voice like a paper cut, in quote. The slats are 3/4 of an inch too wide, and the stain you used is clearly into Oppos. Autumn russet and Oppos. When the board only approved in Oppos, weathered oak and Oppos. For this block, so step aside, I need to conduct a full site measurement and inspect the interior supports, and quote, I just stood there, blinking, still holding my screwdriver. And I remember thinking how absurd it was that this woman thought she had the right to just march through my living room because of fence stain. I told her as calmly as I could that she wasn't in Oppos. Coming in, that if the HOA had a problem, they could send a formal inspector with a 48-hour notice. But Beatrice, she didn't in Oppos. Like being told no, her face turned this mottled shade of purple, and she stepped closer, right into my personal space, whispering that she was the, in quote, eyes and ears of this community, in quote, and that I was, in quote, poisoning the property values, in quote. When I tried to close the door, she actually wedged her expensive leather shoe in the frame. And that's when the vibe shifted from annoying to genuinely creepy, because she pulled out her phone and looked me dead in the eye with this terrifying, blank smile. In quote, fine, in quote. She said, her voice trembling with this weird sort of excitement, in quote. If you want an Oppos, respect the association, perhaps you and Oppos. LL respect the law. I and Oppos. Am calling 911 to report homeowner being verbally abusive and physically barring a community official from performing a safety check. End quote. Now, what Beatrice didn't in Oppos, know, what she couldn't in Oppos, have possibly guessed in a million years, was that my wife, Sarah, wasn't in Oppos, in the kitchen anymore. She had left for her night shift an hour early, and Sarah ISN into Oppos. Just a dispatcher. She's the lead supervisor for the county's emergency response center. She's the woman who talks people through heart attacks and high-speed chases. She's seen it all, and she has this uncanny ability to hear the truth behind a person and Oppo's voice, no matter how much they try to dress it up. As I stood there on the porch, watching Beatrice pace back and forth like she was starring in a legal drama, I felt this cold knot of anxiety in my stomach, thinking about how easy it would be for the police to roll up, see a man with a tool in his hand, and an angry woman screaming about, in quote, threats, and quote, and just assume the worst. But miles away, in a room filled with glowing monitors and the low hum of voices, Sarah picked up a call, and she told me later that the second she heard that shrill, entitled tone, she knew exactly who it was. Beatrice started her performance, her voice going up an octave, claiming she was a, quote, representative of the law, quote, being, in quote, attacked, quote, by a, quote, hostile resident, quote, who was, quote, unstable and armed with a weapon, quote. Sarah sat there, cool as ice, recording every single word, and she asked Beatrice one simple question, quote, Mond Oppos, are you currently in immediate physical danger or witnessing a crime in progress? Quote. And Beatrice, thinking she was being clever, thinking she was finally going to get me evicted or arrested or whatever her twisted goal was, yelled into the phone, quote, yes, he's threatening me with a metal object and refusing to allow a mandatory safety inspection. Send everyone now, quote. Back on the porch, Beatrice hung up and looked at me with this look of pure, unadulterated triumph, like she just won a gold medal in being a nightmare, and she told me to, quote, stay right there, quote, because my, quote, reign of terror, quote, was over. I didn't oppose, say a word. I just leaned against the doorframe, watching her straighten her blazer and check her reflection in my window, and I felt this strange sense of pity for her, this woman whose entire identity was wrapped up in the power she thought she held over a few square feet of suburbia. Then the siren started, faint at first, then growing into that unmistakable wail that makes every neighbor on the block peek through their blinds, and 2 cruisers pulled into my driveway, their lights painting the front of my house in strobes of red and blue. Beatrice practically skipped toward the officers, waving them over like she was directing traffic, pointing at me and shouting about, quote, aggressive behavior, quote, and, quote, illegal structures, quote. But the officers didn't oppose. To even look at the fence, they didn't oppose. To look at mine, quote, autumn russet, quote, stain. The lead officer, a veteran named Miller who I'd seen around the neighborhood, walked right past her and asked me if I was okay. And when Beatrice tried to interrupt, screaming that he should be arresting me, Miller turned around with a look of such profound exhaustion that she actually went silent for a second. Quote, Mond Oppos, quote, he said, his voice echoing in the quiet street, quote. We have the recording of your call, and we have the dispatch report from the supervisor who handled it, who, by the way, happens to be this gentleman's wife, quote. You could actually see the moment the blood drained from Beatrice and Oppos' face. It was like watching a balloon slowly leak air, her mouth open and closed, but no sound came out, and Miller continued, quote, you call an emergency line for a civil HOA dispute, you lied about a weapon, and you fabricated a threat to life to get a faster response time, which in this state is a Class A misdemeanor for misuse of emergency services, quote. When the handcuffs clicked shut, the sound was so sharp and clear it felt like the final note of a long, terrible song. And as they led her toward the car, Beatrice wasn't oppose, quote, queen, quote. Anymore, she was just a small, bitter woman in a blazer that didn't oppose, fit right, sobbing about how, quote, unfair, quote, it all was. The next few weeks were the quietest weeks of my life. The HOA board, terrified of being associated with a criminal case, immediately dropped all the citations against my fence and actually issued a formal apology. And it turns out once the, quote, enforcer, quote, was gone, everyone else in the neighborhood started coming out of their shells, talking to each other, realizing we'd all been living under this weird cloud of fear for way too long. I still see Beatrice sometimes. She's back from her court dates now, but she doesn't oppose. Carry a clipboard anymore, and she doesn't oppose. Look at my mailbox. She just walked from her car to her front door with her head down, a ghost in her own kingdom. But it makes you think, doesn't end oppos. It? How many people are out there right now, using the systems meant to protect us as weapons to settle their own petty grievances? We live in these communities where we're supposed to look out for one another, but sometimes the person claiming to protect the end quote, standards end quote, is the one doing the most damage to the soul of the neighborhood. Was it justice? Or was it just a lucky break that my wife happened to be the one on the other end of that line? I'd love to hear what you guys think. Have you ever dealt with a end quote, Karen end quote, who thought the law was their personal concierge service? Or do you think the HOA actually has a point in trying to keep things uniform? Drop a comment below. Let's talk about where the line between community standards and personal harassment really is. Because from where I'm sitting, sometimes the best way to keep a neighborhood beautiful ISN and oppos. By fixing the fences, but by fixing the people living behind them.